that this is ongoing research. It's not fully complete, so I'm just going to say some general things about sort of the direction that it's heading. And the second thing that I want to say is that some of the things that I'm going to bring up today are things that academics in the field actually tend to sort of struggle to grasp. So I'm going to speak very generally about those things and hopefully get the overall point of them across. Alright, so what are we doing? We've got two different theories. We've got recurrent processing and structural representation. I'm going to can possibly give us any explanation of why there is a unique qualitative nature to our experience of consciousness. So, the first of our two things is recurrent processing. So, the model basically relies on a couple of different kinds of neural activity. So it treats the brain as a kind of neural network, which is a type of system of processing. And within that system, there are two different further types of processing. So there is feed-forward activity, which is the first type up there. And this is the kind of activity where the information in the brain is only travelling in one direction. So if you think about a section of the brain, so in Lame's research, he looks only at the visual cortex. So if we think of that in some sort of linear kind of way, feed-forward processing is information passing from 1 to 2 to 3 and not in the other direction. Then the second kind of processing is recurrent processing. So that's processing that is being then passed back from, say, the third layer to the first layer, or the third layer to the second layer. And then that information is then processed again at that layer, and then once more passed back up to the next layer. So the benefit of this kind of recurrent processing is that on the first pass, the system will sort of extract a certain amount of information that might be relevant to different other processes that are happening in the brain. And then it will pass that same information back to a lower layer to be reprocessed to get even more of the same kind of information back out of that information. So in the case of Lame's research, it means that we sort of slowly within the visual cortex build up a more and more detailed picture of what information is coming in through the retina. So this is a little diagram of how that kind of processing works. So we've got the visual input there is basically the information having come from the retina into the back of the brain. That's then passed forward by this feed-forward mechanism to the next layer of that subsystem. And then eventually that information reaches the point where it begins to propagate back the other direction and begins to start getting reprocessed. It's at this kind of point where those patterns of firing rates within the networks of neurons in the brain start to stabilise into a sort of coherent picture of, whoops, no idea what I missed. Starts to stabilise into a coherent picture of the outside world. So we pass from unconscious information coming in, unconscious information being passed with this feed forward, and then on Lame's account, at the point where it starts to pass back and become a stable pattern, is the point where that information becomes conscious. Now, there's another further step, which is the last one on the bottom right there, where that information then becomes reportable. So it gets passed then from the visual cortex into the frontal cortex and becomes something that I can then tell you about. So within 200 milliseconds of me having looked at you, I now have a conscious picture of you in my head, and then I can start to tell you about what I'm seeing when I'm looking at you. Alright, so Lame has a whole different range of things that he proposes as evidence for this theory that the recurrent activity is necessary for consciousness. So the first thing that he points out is that we lack reportability during feed-forward activity. So during that 40 to 100 millisecond period where the information is not being passed back in this network, we are not able to report on that information. It hasn't yet become conscious. And he uses a method called backward masking to show this. So basically, the subject is shown an image, and then within the 40 millisecond period, a different image is shown. The subject will not be able to report on the initial stimulus, but by tracking the activity through the network, they're able to show that there is feed-forward activity of that initial stimulus happening. The second thing that he points to is that anaesthetised animals still experience feed-forward activity. So basically, stick some electrodes in an animal's brain, knock the animal out, and provide the animal with some kind of stimulus, and that feed-forward activity that happens, the pre-conscious activity, is still trackable. And the third thing that he points to is that by sticking some electrodes on the outside of the head, you can send electromagnetic pulses into the brain that will interrupt the recurrent activity, and those interruptions to recurrent activity cause loss of consciousness. Okay, so the problem that I mentioned before, the explanatory gap, how does this purely physical account, this recurrent processing account, tell us about the qualitative nature of conscious experience? Well, the answer is that it doesn't on its own, and Lame freely admits that in his papers. He admits that that is one of the problems, one of the future research avenues. So what I'm going to do is appeal to the local contents of the actual information that's being processed. And I'll refer to that information as a representation. So, what is representation? Clark and Toribio wrote a really good paper that nicely spells it out in 1994, where they suggest that a system is representational if and only if it contains objects or states which genuinely stand in for other objects or states. These objects and states have this relation of standing in because it is their function to stand in. And finally, they perform this function within some general scheme of standing in. So the idea here is that consciousness is this scheme of standing in. The consciousness exists to provide stand-ins within the brain for objects and states in the world. Alright, so structural representation. Now this is the part that I'm told the academics in this field struggle to understand. It's a bit of a tricky concept. So it's not representation in the sense that a picture represents its subject. So if you look at a portrait, that portrait represents whoever the subject of that portrait was. This is a different kind of representation. So this is representation that preserves certain structural relations between one set of objects and another. Alright, so in this case, we have set 1 things in the world and set 2 patterns of neuron firing rates. So when I look at a chair, the relation between that and the other objects in the world should be the same as the relation between the neural firing rate that is instantiated in my brain and the other ones that correspond to the other objects in the world. So if these representations are information that is being processed by the recurrent activity which is necessary for consciousness, then we have different conscious states in virtue of the particular locally representative features of the brain at the time of the conscious experience. So what does all this mean? So recurrent processing on Lame's account is necessary for consciousness. He's shown that through experimentation, where there is no consciousness if there is no recurrent activity. Structural representation gives us some way to show how that recurrent activity is different based on what is happening within your field. Consciousness then is a representational mechanism where states are differentiated by their local neural properties, which in turn correspond to features of the environment. States of phenomenal consciousness are nothing more than stable neuron firing patterns, which represent features of the environment. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
That was great, first of all. I think thank you. But so recurring activity is going to be necessary for there to be consciousness. But once you've got that portable representation that then moves forward through frontal and cortical regions, what's the relationship between the recurrent theory there and the qualitative nature of experience? Is there one at that point, or is it just that you need recurrent activity to set up the representation of the first time to play an active role first time?
Yeah, so the idea is that there is no representation until the activity is stable and recurrent. Otherwise, you've basically just got junk information being passed around the network. Basically without the recurrent activity, there is no consciousness, whether that consciousness has qualitative features or not. Yep, tell that.
Would that mean also that at the stage of when you're actually first having your environmental experiences and the neural firing is occurring, then that's the conscious representation of what's happening out in the world? What about when you're doing recall? Would you expect to have exactly the same, would it be like a reproduction of that exact same neural firing that actually would be almost like, not necessarily a mirror, but a stamp of the experience that you've had of the world, but now within your own personal mind?
So memory and recall aren't really part of the research at this point. I will hopefully be looking at a bit of that next year in my research project. But I would suggest that they wouldn't be exactly the same, just based on if you recall a scenario, your recollection of that scenario isn't the same experience as actually being there. So there will be some differences, but it should be relatively similar in that it will contain some number of objects that were there, and they will stand in similar relations to how they stood when you experienced them. Any other questions?
I just had a more general question. A lot of your work is based on the premise of Lame's group. I can see up here it said references seem to have petered out in about 2004. I'm just wondering, is this work you're doing an extension of his work, or I'm just wondering about the originality of this?
Yeah. So my intention is to take the work that he did. In his last paper, he seemed to be suggesting that he was going to continue the work as well, but I haven't yet seen any papers. So in his papers, as I mentioned before, he identifies some problems with his own research. So my intention here is to take his research and take up one or two of the problems that he identified and see if I can help him to fill the gaps that he left for himself.